Hi, I'm Rod Suskin, and welcome to Rod TV, my YouTube channel where I get to talk about, well, whatever I want to say about matters astrological, spiritual, anything to do with something a little bit alternative about how we see the world, how we understand the world, and how we approach our spiritual lives. And so this is the episode to kick off the year with, and to kick off with the astrological predictions for South Africa for the year ahead. Well, every year as the new year begins, we hope for a better year, and I, and many astrologers no doubt, get asked lots of questions about what does the year ahead hold, and can you tell us something good about the year ahead, and so on. So I thought before I get into all the little details about what's going to be happening in 2016, I need to help you understand how an astrologer sees that, and in fact, what the limitations are of the astrological way of looking at the year ahead and looking at the future when you're talking about a country can have, like this one, 50 million people in it. And so obviously we don't all experience that future the same way. So there are natural limitations. And in fact, the limitations are also technical. Astrologers have had various ways of trying to understand how do you predict the fate of a land when you have so many matters to consider. It is true that it is one of the earliest tasks of astrology to try and understand the fate of the kingdom or whatever an astrologer might have been called upon to do. But astrology really has also always been about individuals, and an individual with their limited data of being born on a particular date, at a particular place, at a particular time, give the astrologer all the information that we need to do what we do. So, when is a country born, and how do we say that it is a country, and what happens when it changes or its political dispensation changes? So, those are the issues on the one hand that face us. And also, as I said, the fact that we're dealing with a much larger picture than we are with an individual. So, let's call it political astrology. With political astrology, we have a way of having to weigh up what is more or less likely to happen. Political astrology, more than any astrology, is a little bit like weather forecasting. Nothing's ever 100% likely. Some things are pretty much more certain than other things, but we have a kind of level of probability. And we need to understand that astrology works the same way, and particularly political astrology works the same way because of the weighing up of those factors. And also because of other things. So when it comes to South Africa, what it boils down to, after the fact that you can't really say where does a country begin, and is the country in 1994 different than the country of 1961, the old republic versus the new republic? No, I don't mean Star Wars. So what astrologers really do is they look at the unfolding of the cycles through the equinoxes and the solstices, through eclipses, and through the fate more of the president of the country. And using those factors together is how we try and assess what's really happening in that part of the world as we know it. And so one of the issues we face is that with the president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, we lack the most critical piece of information, and that is the time of his birth. The time of a birth gives the astrologer context for the events that happen in somebody's life. So without a time of birth, I might be able to say that there's a change in someone's life, but I'm not necessarily able to say in what part of their life, how it affects their life. So that is one of the matters that we have to take into consideration as what limits us when talking about South Africa at its current place in its history. But I think, as you'll see, we've got enough information here this year to get a sense of what's really going on, and more than anything, how to ride the wave. Astrology is realistic. There's never going to be a year when an astrologer says, finally, all our troubles are over and you're going to have the most fantastic year you've ever heard of. Because, anyway, what is a year? It's a kind of a human construct. A year, a period of time, is actually a period of space. What we call a year is, in fact, an orbit of the sun, or the Earth around the sun. it's nothing time, it's actually space. Even what we call a day is a spin of the Earth on its axis. It's a spatial event. For the rest, we impose this calendar on that movement and call it time. And so, as you know, the idea that the 1st of January magically ushers in something different than what was there before is one of the other limitations that we have to take into account and understand that we're really talking about a flow of cycles at this time and how they seem to pertain to this part of the world. So, hopefully you understand some of what we're working with, especially since cycles are a good place to start. Over the last 7 years, we have been passing through a phase of some really extraordinary cycles. There are major cycles that affect the politics and the belief system, society itself, much more than they affect the individual. They affect the individual, but that effect is percolated down from the bigger stuff. It's not the changes in our own lives. And every few decades, a bunch of those will come together. And this last period of time, particularly the period around 2012 to 2015, really a very strong time, but very much in action since 2008, when a bunch of planets came together that hadn't been together since the 60s. And they caused a lot of social upheaval and everything else in the 60s, and they did it all over again in the early 2010s, as you know, from the end of the first decade of the current century. Well, the good news is those cycles are simmering down. I mean, you have seen political change, social change in the world that is unprecedented more or less since the 60s. That kind of magnitude of it all coming at the same time is really what we speak about. People often think it's never been like this before, and the world's never been like this before, but I mean, it always has. And to an astrologer, sometimes it's as recently as 50 years ago. Easy to forget, but of course, the social upheaval of the 60s was just as dramatic as what we experienced recently. And the previous time this bunch came together, the 1930s, when of course the world was completely turned on its head. So it happens before and it happens again. And it's one of those clusters that has sometimes caused wars and sometimes caused complete changes of political systems that is just beginning to come to an end and leaving the world as a rather different place from what it was before. And it's that we gradually start putting together over the next few years. And South Africa is as much a part of that as everyone else is. And that has been responsible for not only the massive social change that we've seen in many countries in the world, but also the financial issues and the financial changes that have really rocked the world for a while, and which of course are one of the major questions that people have been asking me about what's going to happen this year. So what are the cycles for now? I mean, if those cycles have all settled down, then presumably there's some other cycles to talk about. Fortunately, not so much those major earth-shattering ones, and we're just in their wake a little bit. But we do have one major cycle that is really all about appearance versus reality and coming down to earth. If I had to say a theme for the world at this time of history, this year, it is about coming down to earth. Things are not what they seem, facing harsh realities, coming down to earth. And that is also very true in the charts of South Africa at a more local level than just the global cycle. So we are going to pick up on that theme here and discover that a lot about 2016 is about facing reality. And the astrological way of understanding facing reality is that although reality is hard and illusion is glamorous, so obviously it can't be fun to have to face reality, in the end, reality is much more powerful, because it also contains the force of growth and authority and establishment, power and strength. And those are some of the things that we're seeing South Africa struggle towards at this time in its history. You know, South Africa turned 21 last year, and 7 year cycles are very major cycles in astrology. In fact, they're slightly longer than 7 years. And the 7 year cycles of a country, this is the 1994 version of the country, as I alluded to at the beginning of this, The 7 year cycles of a country somewhat resemble the 7 year cycles of a person. So after the age of 21, there's a beginning of maturity. And if you think about the human experience and the 7 year cycle, 7 years of kind of early childhood where you become formed, and 7 years of childhood, 7 to 14, where you grow, and 7 years of teenagehood, 14 to 21, where you kind of reap the results of what was established for the first 14 years, teenagehood, and then 21 to 28, when you take on adulthood and begin to mature, so that by 28 you are mature. And so that's the process that this incarnation of South Africa, this constitution and this way of seeing ourselves is taking. So on the whole, we can generally expect that the further away we get from the age of 21, the better things improve. It's not unusual for the end teens and early 20s to be very rocky in anybody's life. So this is the year we'll turn 22, and we begin to head off into our own new 7 year cycle, which can also help things improve. And we're trying to get some establishment. We're still trying to find our identity. And in astrology, it takes 28, 29 years to find identity. It doesn't happen quickly, not for anyone, and least of all a country. So that is something that we have to remember. It's something that we kind of have forgotten about ourselves, perhaps, that it's easy to think after 20 years, shouldn't we be somewhere else? But we've got to remember, what does 20 years mean? And put it into the shape of a person, because it's the same cycles that we're using to measure it. And it's the human experience that we are talking about in our individual lives. We don't only talk about a historical scale. We can talk about our own lives and say, well, you've got to sit with something and see it go through up to 30 years to see what it really becomes. And you can look back in some political history and see a lot of that. A good place to look, if you want to do that research, is the changes that happen in Egypt, which happen about every 29 or 30 years there. Of course, the local circumstances will always depend on what kind of changes. So let's get a little bit more personal than that and look at how those cycles are now about us, not just about general 7 year cycles or general appearance versus reality cycles or anything like that. Really talk about our own cycles. And looking at the year ahead, we're going to break it down into the quarters of the year. So, zooming in a little bit more closely, we see that the first quarter of 2016 is very much about what you don't see. It's a time of many things done in secret. There's a lot going on behind closed doors, and there's a lot of kind of deception, secrecy that's out there in the world, things happening behind the scenes. One of them that occurs to me is even the new laws about retirement funds and tax laws that recently, this week, caused COSATU such consternation that they said they were kind of snuck in the background. And that's happened a few times in the last few weeks, about things being quietly gazetted and put out there and no big show made about them. There's a lot more of that going on. We need to be more vigilant about that. And there's a lot going on behind the scenes. After a rocky end of 2015, that isn't surprising. The charts show President Zuma keeping a low profile and even being a little bit isolated, not in the Mbeki sense of the word, but being isolated at this time. He needs to play it carefully, because there's stuff going on around him that is he's not necessarily entirely aware of, or that is also related to how the government view themselves at a bigger level, or how the party views itself as a bigger level. At the same time, though, at this time, the charts show the opposition parties are not very strong. They're somewhat fragmented, although working hard at developing new ideas. I mean, knowing that it's a year of local elections and looking at this chart, I would say that the opposition parties are working very hard at the moment to come up with really powerful policy approach. A lot of the fighting in the politics of this country has been done on the level of delivery and sometimes of issues to do with culture and racism, as we know, and we'll talk about in other episodes of this show. But right now it's really going to be about policy, and we've reached a point where we actually need to review what are the ideas with which we manage this country. And I think the opposition parties are going to pick that up very, very strongly. Keeps on showing strong signs towards secondary opposition, which we will have to call the EFF, rather than official opposition, which shows as somewhat troubled in the charts at the moment, but also working at it. Financial issues are not getting any easier, and it's during this first quarter of the year that we might suffer a ratings crisis, being rated by the ratings agencies crisis, just like we've suffered from extreme fluctuations of currency, and that's going to continue throughout the first quarter. It's not going to get much better throughout the course of the year, as you'll hear me say, but probably towards the end of the year, we will be in a somewhat better position. So there's always that, but it's going to be pretty rocky for a while. And in this first period as well, that's also going to make for difficulties in Parliament. This is the time that Parliament opens. The opposition plan a vote of no confidence. It shows very strongly in the chart, but Parliament itself being somewhat compromised. Could that mean more action, violence, or something like that in Parliament? Don't know, but what it does show is that while the vote of no confidence against President Zuma will not succeed, it might be a little bit more surprising than it was last time, which happened nearly a year ago. The second quarter of the year is, of course, when the elections are going to take place around about May, most likely. And the second quarter of the year's chart is extremely different than it was in the first quarter. We can see the government fighting, we can see the president fighting very strongly, coming out in an extremely forthright and aggressive manner, as in really being warlike. But at the same time, in the elections themselves, taking quite a pounding, bigger than they might have expected, even though I think they do expect it. When it comes to elections and election results, once we know the date of that, we'll be talking about that on a future show. And so I'm not going to go into anything much about that now. But we can see that after the period of elections, there is great challenge to the government. And we can see that after that kind of taking a beating, there are some rapid developments in the presidency. Now, when the question on everyone's mind is, will Zuma fall, or what's going to happen when Zuma must fall, and that kind of thing, and the answer is not a clear answer. When the time came for President Mbeki to be recalled, that was predictable. I predicted that a year before, and you could see it very clearly in the charts. It's not clear in these charts. There's only one of the three factors that we needed to see that for Mbeki. But there is one, and one does insert a probability, but it's not a possibility. But it's not so much about whether he falls or not. What the chart really shows is great changes beginning in President Zuma's life, possibly around May. Astrology works with window periods that have three highlights: the beginning, a period in the middle, and the end. The window period, May, August, November, May to November, also strong in August, is a time of significant change for President Zuma. It's likely this change happens in his own life, but whatever it is, it affects the presidency and presumably the country very strongly. It's possible that it's political change, just less likely than it was with President Zuma. It's basically boils down to, although I'm not convinced it's enough to say the president falls, I can say that Jacob Zuma's year ends very differently than it began. The presidency might look very different than it began, and I wouldn't be 100% surprised if that wasn't with the same president. But I think it's more likely that there are changes that have a significant impact, and there are changes in the president's own life that do. The problem is, I don't have his birth time, and I really can't see a context for these changes that are happening in his life, but they are shown as significant changes. So we'll just have to see. But you definitely will see significant developments in the president's life that are probably going to lead to significant changes in the presidency. It'll come up again. Meanwhile, there's so much more unrest and labor issues. We know Kassachi is unhappy. They will be unhappy with the way the election is handled and the results of the election. There's a lot of unrest at that level. And of course, at the fees must fall student level, which is so not going away, and I think is going to increasingly have success. As the year progresses, the charts show the government drawing on outside resources and further resources in order to fund things. And I think they do seem to appreciate the crisis in education and are likely to continue doing something about that. So that continues to push towards victory in the fees must fall movement, or other changes in the sphere of education. But education is very much on the table, at least at the scale as it was last year. So very much more of that ongoing. The third quarter is the most challenging time for the government. Obviously, there have been changes because of their reduced power in the elections. As I said, they will take a beating. There is one way to look at areas in astrology, and astrology would agree with the whispers that fly in the air that the government is likely to at least lose another two municipalities. Um, Not easy to say which they are, but it does. There are significant indications still in the Cape, which puts Port Elizabeth on the map, and as we know, possibly others in the north of the country. That is a part of the weakening that happens, as well as other challenges that again cause a lot of behind the scenes movement. So while there's a lot hidden, the third quarter is also a time when truth will out. In fact, the first few quarters of the year are also a lot about media developments. There's a new struggle developing with the media. You've seen hints of it. Did you see what happened with the journalist Corinne Duplessis, who found herself apologizing to the government um, for what she said? It was worth an apology, but it was one of those things that maybe got out of hand and did cause the press as an institution to step up, and there's going to be more of that. There's going to be more fighting for freedom, but the press are going to be right up there exposing a lot, and the third quarter of the year is a time when there are both cover-ups and the beginnings of exposures, more of which happening in the fourth quarter of the year. So stuff coming out that also causes a lot of changes and behind the scenes action, as well as continuing financial volatility. First three quarters of the year, financial volatility until it does start settling down by about December. So, well, even before December, until it does start settling down um, by the last quarter of the year, where we should see some improvement at that time. It's also in the third quarter, late in the third quarter, that the government starts shifting how it's doing some of its trade relationships and does create beneficial relationships for South Africa. We can see that important developments with friends, diplomatic developments, and trade developments later in the quarter are very beneficial to South Africa. Astrology doesn't judge the politics of the country in question, it just says the trade is benefiting us, resources from outside are benefiting us, and we are getting resources from outside during that third quarter. It is also going to make us a little bit beholden unto others, and fourth quarter, again, warnings of selling our resources or allowing other countries access to our resources in exchange for something. An ongoing problem in this country, as we know, but there will probably be a bit of an outcry similar to what we've seen about some mining and nuclear issues before happening in the last quarter of the year. As ever, things are not what they seem. The planets of illusion and delusion are so strong throughout this year that there's this whole sense of the dichotomy between what you're not seeing, what's happening behind the scenes, what's presented in front, what's brought out by the press. And you'll remember that I started off by saying it's about appearance versus reality. That is the theme of this year, and you're going to see that. You're going to see one thing and then discover another thing continuously. But it is the waking up and facing reality that in the long run could work well for us. Late in the year is another serious crisis time for the government. It is an extremely challenging November and December, and it's most likely that the changes that I've alluded to in the presidency or with the president are actually around the November-December period. But remember, from May through August, November, December, very strong possibilities of things to do with changes in the presidency and within the government itself. The last months of this year, very challenging to the government, in December particularly, just like it was in 2015. The president himself is also shown as doing something which tarnishes the image of the country, not something terribly unusual. But he's also the kind of bounce back president who manages not to get too severely affected by that. In summary, outside of the details, everything points to a big shake-up this year. including or related to the state of the president or the presidency itself. And although I think the odds are against there being a recall in the Mbeki sense of the word, I wouldn't be at all surprised if Zuma didn't end the year as the president, or there was some big change that caused him to not end the year as president. And it's possible that there's a kind of the bounce back president gets saved by the bell, that there's some other change or development that causes him to not be the president, some development in his own life. But realistically, those don't usually change the presidency. One other thing I would like to point out as well is that if we were in a much less stable situation, these are the circumstances that astrologers could use to predict a sudden coup within the presidency, not of the country, of the presidency, as kind of happened in 1989 with the National Party in this country when de Klerk replaced Botha. So that might also be something that shows there, but it's not quite as unstable. There's nothing much supporting that in the chart because, on the whole, the chart's showing that while the government is under crisis, that everyone's waking up, the people are waking up more, they obviously will put more pressure. It is an election year. That puts more pressure. And facing reality means addressing things that need to be addressed. And sometimes, even though deception leads to it, but by things being exposed, having to own up to things and face reality. There's also a very strong friend that we get help from our friends, be it the government or the country getting help from our friends. And that's not a bad thing. We need it. Thanks, we'll take it. Come and help us. And that will really put us on a much surer footing for 2017, which, given the circumstances at the end of this year, looks to be a much stronger year. But we'll talk about that in 2017. In the meanwhile, there's a lot of, while it's more of the same and it's still unstable, it's nothing new, it's not getting worse. Stuff gets exposed that lets us face reality, takes longer than we'd like to get the financial matters in order. There are big changes in the presidency that we are likely to like. And by the end of the year, we find ourselves feeling a little bit stronger about the future. But it is going to take us pushing through this whole year to get there. So don't lose heart or despair. This isn't the magic change of the 1st of January. We've got to deal with the stirrings that have happened. We can see the crisis around racism and social issues that now need to be addressed. It's a good thing to face reality. We're turning 22. We're finally actually becoming adult, and we're going to start maturing ourselves from now on. It's never been an easy ride, but we are still looking like we're going to make it. So let's keep pushing at it. And now, one of your questions. A viewer, Barbara, asks if this is the right time to grow her business. And looking at her chart and her question, Barbara, the answer is look, this is definitely a time for some major changes in your life. You've got to kind of own your own power and act courageously. To be fair, I wouldn't have used exactly the phrase, this is the time to grow your business. I'm going to go one step before that and say, this is the time to make some major changes that require a bit of courage, stepping into your own power, stepping into your own boots, doing what needs to be done, and that will lead to your growing the business. What's the difference? It's like saying, this is not the time to rush up and open another branch and expand, grow. That's one step ahead of ourselves. This is the time to kind of take the reins, say, this is who I am. I'm going to do my thing now, the next big thing or my next powerful thing, and that will make a big shift. And then later in the year, probably around about from September onwards, you'll see a much clearer sign of growth. Remember, if you've got a personal question for me, go to this URL or email me, tv@rodsuskin.com over there, and ask your question. Include your date, place, and time of birth. And if it's a good question, it will get onto the air. And a good question is one that's got a clear yes or no kind of answer or a very clear outcome, and that is important and meaningful for you. So get to that website. You can also make suggestions about the show, ask questions about anything else, and what you want to see here. I've got lots of ideas and surprises up my sleeve for you. I just can't wait. So hopefully you've subscribed to the YouTube channel and you'll be back here next week, like every other Friday, where next week I'll be handling your future for the year 2016. It's like sun signs. Do they mean something? Why would they mean something? And if they mean something, what's going to happen to you in 2016? So see you here next week.